The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
Our speaker today, Neil MacFarquhar, is the UN Bureau Chief of the New York Times. Prior to his current position, he was based in Cairo for 5 years as the Times Middle East correspondent. Tonight he will be speaking on his new book, Media Relations Department of Hizbollah Wishes You a Happy Birthday. The book is unique in that it weaves together the author's experiences of growing up in Libya with his adult years spent in the Middle East as a correspondent. And as a result, he is able to fill in the missing pieces between the outside image of the Middle East, which we commonly see portrayed as being overwhelmed with conflict, and what he calls the much more engaging internal reality of the Middle East that is filled with warmth and humanity. Thus, this engrossing book provides a perspective of the Middle East that we rarely are exposed to through media in the U.S. It is with great pleasure that I welcome and introduce Neil MacFarquhar.
Good evening, and thank you all for turning out on a rainy night. When people find out that you're the Middle East correspondent for the New York Times, the first response is, I have a question for you. And I always brace for it because it's usually, when is there going to be peace in the Middle East? And you don't gain any credibility by predicting that. But I was about in the fourth year of my tenure as the Middle East bureau chief and correspondent when I was on vacation in San Francisco, and a woman came up to me at a dinner party and she said, I've got a question for you. So I was bracing myself, and she said, aren't there any normal people in the Middle East? People like you and me, or at least people we could relate to? And I said, yeah, sure, all kinds. What have you been reading? And she said, the New York Times. So I kind of thought about it for a little while, and I realized that my tenure there had more or less coincided with a sea of violence, starting with the 9/11 attacks and proceeding through the invasion of Iraq and various other not uprisings exactly, but explosions in Saudi Arabia. And I thought, there's just such a gap between the perception and the reality, because of course I had to write about those events because they were sort of the main news events, but my life unrolled in a completely different world as well, because there were a lot of people that I knew and appreciated. And I had sort of experienced that gap early on in my life because I first moved to Libya as a 3-year-old, where my father was a chemical engineer, and we lived in a town that was basically wholly owned by the oil company, and it was Esso, which was the precursor to Exxon, and they sort of fenced off 11 square miles next to the Mediterranean and called it theirs, and the Libyans had to be out by 5 o'clock, and for us kids, we didn't really notice the difference. We went to Esso Elementary School, and every afternoon we ran down to the beach and we sailed and swam in the Mediterranean. And it was a little bit like, growing up in Club Med, or as I used to call it, Texas on the Mediterranean. But the mark of our isolation, I think the strongest mark of our isolation came on September 1st, 1969, because every day before I went to school, I would sit down and eat cornflakes with my father, and he would flip on the BBC World Service on the radio and listen to the headlines. And the headline that day was, there's been a coup in Libya, and Major Muammar al-Gaddafi has seized control of the government. And we kind of stared at each other, really? And there was no hint in the town at all that the government of the country where we were living had just changed. So when I went back there as a correspondent, particularly for the Times, I was determined to try and make a difference that time and just sort of enmesh myself more in the fabric of the society. And as luck would have it, the first assignment I got when I showed up in the Middle East, I showed up in January, and 2 weeks later I was on my way to Libya because the Lockerbie bomber who'd been acquitted was on his way home. And, so I was thrilled because I'd always wanted to go back to my childhood home. So I showed up in Libya, and it was a very different Libya than the one I had left, because by now it had been living under, by then it had been living, more than 30 years, and they just passed the 40-year mark of Gaddafi's rule. And he's a very, he changes his mind a lot. He's a Mercurial leader. And the problem that was sort of unrolling while I was there is nobody could figure out what year it was because he kept changing the date. And most Muslims, the Muslim calendar is dated from the year that Muhammad emigrated from Mecca to Medina to sort of really gathered his followers together to sort of make the religion work. And Gaddafi decided that he didn't want it that way. He was going to change it to the year that Muhammad died, and that would be preferable. And then a couple of years later he said, no, it'd be better to count from the year that Muhammad was born. So there were it had been 1429, and then it switched to 1431, and then suddenly it was 1369, and, the event organizers just kind of threw up their hands and put the Western date in parentheses next to whatever event they were trying to organize, and ordinary people just kind of threw up their hands. And Gaddafi has this thing, his conceit is that he doesn't actually rule the country, that he's the guide to the revolution, but the Libyan people themselves run everything. And it doesn't extend to the oil business or anything important, but on sort of social matters, whenever he has an idea, he convenes popular committees, and it's usually twice a year or so, and the entire country is required to attend them. So and there's no getting around it. So the news that I had gone for was largely over, but I couldn't travel anywhere because the airlines shut down and all the travel agencies shut down and the food stores shut down and everything shuts down and everybody has to go to these popular committee meetings. And if you don't go, you may not be allowed to travel outside the country or you can get in trouble. So I sort of thought this was going to be terrible, but I resigned myself to the inevitable, and I wandered down Revolution Street to where one was unrolling in a movie theater about this size. And it turned out to be great because it was the one place where Libyans were allowed to freely express their opinion. And so they talked about all the problems they were having. And occasionally, Gaddafi at one point had decided that he wanted to ban elementary schools, that mothers should all teach their children at home. And of course, the mothers, rose up in arms at these popular committee meetings, and they shot the idea down. But the day I was there, they were talking about this date business and why they couldn't be like every other Muslim country. And that's what one woman stood up and she said, why does every other Muslim country do it one way and we do it differently? Can't we just be normal? And, I didn't realize that at the time what an important question that is, because it's one that resonates around the Middle East about, why they aren't normal and why they seem to be out of step with history and out of step with the rest of the world. And, I tried to devote as much time as I could to reporting on what the normal was and what day-to-day life was like, because I thought that would illustrate what, they are struggling with. And sometimes it was, a great deal of fun. One of my all-time favorites was in Iran, and it's an actually easier country to report in than you think. But I was in Iran one year, and I turned on the news on the weekend and found out that a provincial cleric had issued a fatwa against dogs, and he said that owning dogs, was a sin. And it is true that in the Muslim faith, most dogs, except for sort of guard dogs and sheep dogs, are considered ritually unclean. And apparently in Iran, they had tried, because they want to build a perfect Muslim society, they had tried ever since the revolution in 1979 to get rid of dogs. So he had given this sermon, this provincial cleric, and he had said, the people who died on the battlefield in the Iran-Iraq war were particularly lucky because they didn't live to see women wearing hats and men carrying dogs. And because some women, instead of wearing the traditional veil, had started wearing baseball caps. So I started asking questions about this, and it turned out that because they had banned dogs, and I was interested in the topic, first of all, because just in fatwas in general, people in the West tend to associate them with the death sentence, because the one that Ayatollah Khomeini made against Salman Rushdie in 1989 is the one that is the most famous. And so I kind of wanted to find an example to show that it's something that enters into people's day-to-day lives, and I thought the dog one was a perfect example of that, because it turns out that they, as I said, they roll them out every 2 years or so. And so I met this woman, and she had a big black poodle, and she'd taken it out for a walk one day, and it was about from me to where that food table is, and along came two men on a motorcycle and kidnapped it, because it turns out that there's a premium on dogs. And so, she had gone down to the animal bazaar. There's a whole section of the Tehran bazaar that's devoted to animals, and she found it for sale. So I thought, well, I'll go to the animal bazaar and see what happens. And, I don't know if this neighborhood in Chicago still has the reputation for being sort of a center for drugs anymore or not. I haven't been here for a while, but it was like Thompson Square Park in New York, where, you walk the park and people are offering you things, and I'd walk along and they saw I was a Western, and they'd say, got a dog, you want a dog? Or one guy came right up to my ear and he whispered, he said, I got a German Shepherd, you want a German Shepherd? And one of the people I ran into at the bazaar was sort of a municipal dog catcher. And so I started interviewing him about, what his work was like. He said, no, we don't ban dogs. You're allowed to have it as long as you're, you have a permit and the shots are in order. It's fine. And a man in the crowd who heard him explaining this to me said, you're a liar. You took my dog away for no reason. And he started to strangle the guy. And so the police had to intervene. And in the melee, somebody came up and whispered to me, and he said, there's no laws in Iran for the way they take away dogs, just like people. And, I just thought, wow, it's a great way to show how the society really works and the problems people have. And it was also sort of a telling example, because owning dogs was sort of a subtle form of rebellion, the way people sort of fought the system. It's like, well, the government of the mullahs doesn't like dogs, and we don't like the government, so we're going to own a dog just to sort of show them that we don't like them. So those kind of stories I thought were great in illuminating how life unrolls in the Middle East, but unfortunately, a lot of the times I was caught up in war and the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But so at one point in 2004, my editors came to me and they said, we know your 4-year tenure's up, but we'd really like you to stay another year. If you do stay another year, is there a special project you would like to do? And I said yes, because at that point the United States had started making sort of a policy of increasing democracy in the region. And I thought, well, we've heard this policy from the outside, but what's happening on the inside? And so they gave me more or less a year to go to a bunch of countries and just sort of find 1 or 2 democracy or social activists in each country and use that to illustrate how the battle for change was coming along, or the struggle for change was coming along. After 4 years of writing about so much violence, I was sort of pessimistic about the region a little bit, the future. And I was especially appreciative because the people I met on this odyssey really sort of restored my faith in the region, that there were people in the Middle East that were working for change, and they were really committed to it. And it really didn't matter what the outside world did; they were going to stick to it. And I think those kind of people are incredibly brave, and they often get lost, amidst the daily stories about the war in Iraq, etc. But basically, I came away with 6 points, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to sort of give those examples of the things that people are struggling against. And the first one is, the grip of the secret police, because they just sort of stifle any kind of activity, political, social, or otherwise, in those countries because they are so powerful. And the second one is that it's difficult to sort of fight the secret police or any kind of, government action, because even if the laws are on the books allowing you to do it, what's written on the books and what's practiced in terms of the law are not necessarily one and the same thing, because the governments just kind of tend to override the law if they don't like it. And the third problem would be the lack of civil rights in terms of the ability to organize, because when people see problems and they want to get together and build civil society and affect change, they can't, because the main right they're missing is the right to assembly and the right to free speech, and so it's difficult to sort of pull together a movement that's going to oppose the government or push for social change. And the fourth issue is the one group that has sort of managed to do that because they don't need to organize in the public space, they can organize in the mosques, is sort of the Islamic parties, and there's sort of a question hanging over them of whether they're really committed to sort of universal rights and civil rights for the whole society. And then the other problem in the region is that the governments they're fighting against tend to be minority governments. It's either one family, one tribe, one military clique, or a religious minority that runs all those countries, and so they have such a large stake in survival that they don't really want anyone to question them. And people were hoping that, with the generational change, as the older rulers who were around in the 60s, 70s, 80s and died out, and their sons took over, that this would be, that they were partially Western educated, or they'd spent time outside, and they were certainly more sophisticated than their fathers were, that they would, inherently bring change. And that has not proved to be the case. And the reason these 6 points are important is because, if you want to fight extremism and you want those societies to be more open, you have to allow these kind of rights to flourish, or you have to at least get them started. And that's, the stronger way than just trying to tell people that their religion is wrong, because, you're trying to impose that from outside, and you want the movements to sort of come from inside the countries themselves, so they'll have sort of roots and be strong. And I can't get over, I can't exaggerate the role of the secret police in stopping that kind of activity. And, the word for the secret police in Arabic is mukhabarat, and it's one of the first words that anybody who moves there, even foreigners, learn, because you inevitably have a run-in with them. And my run-in with the mukhabarat came fairly early in my tenure there in 2001. I was at Mohammed Atta's grade school, and as many of you remember, he was sort of the evil genius behind the 9/11 attacks, and so I was out looking for his teachers, and I'd finished the interview, and I was standing across the street from the school, and I was waiting for my driver to show up, and I was standing in front of the headquarters of the secret police, and I was just loitering a little too long for their comfort, so they came and they, "Come in here, what are you doing? Who are you?" So I explained, and they made the phone calls to the Ministry of Information and, checked my credentials, and sure enough, I was bona fide, and they said, "Okay, you can go." So I went and stood outside, and my driver still didn't come, and they opened the door again and said, "You know what, that wasn't long enough, come back in." So they came back in, and they sort of shunted me from office to office for about an hour, and finally I walked into an office of a major, and he had 11 diplomas from the FBI on the wall behind him. And one was for sharpshooting, I remember, and one was for English, and one was for interrogation. And so he said, "Sit down." And I said, "Is this an interrogation?" And he said, "No, it's tea." And so he served me tea, and we talked for about an hour about, he was responsible for the 5,000 Americans who live in Egypt. For, his point of view is he was responsible for their safety and security. He wanted to know what I thought of the country, etc. So we had a fine, friendly conversation, and he let me go. But after that, he always made sure that I knew that he was watching. And we would do stuff, especially anything involving the Muslim Brotherhood. He was on to me immediately. And I had heard that there were more sermons, anti-American sermons were cropping up more and more in the mosques, and they were being recorded and distributed. So I tried to go out and buy some, and of course nobody would sell me anything. So I went out with one of my Egyptian staffers, and she bought a few tapes, and so we were listening to them, and the phone rings in the office, and it's the major, and he's like, "What's on the tapes?" And Abir Alem, who was the Egyptian reporter, God bless her, she said, "Go buy your own." But and I don't want to make it seem like it was all, it was nervous for us, but obviously for the Egyptians it was nerve-wracking in a much larger way, because they could interfere in any aspect of their lives. And I don't want to make it seem like it was always a one-way street. Sometimes it worked to our advantage. We were in a little Egyptian village, and we were trying to interview sort of a high-powered, the family of the military planner for Al-Qaeda had been killed in Afghanistan, and we were out looking for his family to get a reaction. And the father said no, he wouldn't talk to us. And then suddenly somebody materialized who said he was the brother, and he gets out of a car with no license plate, and there's 3 guys with him, and they all have biceps like the size of my thigh. And he's like, "We'll talk to you, but we have to get permission from the secret police." So we're like, okay. So we go, and they take us to like this darkened factory with a chain link fence around. Says, "This is secret police, we'll go inside and we'll get permission." And Abir was with me again. I said, "Call the major," and thank God he answered on the first ring, which he usually didn't do. And we said, "Where's the secret police headquarters in this town?" And he described it, and we knew we weren't there, and so we hightailed it out of there. It could be an advantage to know somebody in it, but it usually worked to people's detriment. And the example that I use in the book is a young Jordanian poet. He's about 35 now, and he is a civic engineer. He supervises construction projects, but he's always used poetry as a sort of political message since he was in college. They called him the poet of the University of Jordan. He's, stocky guy, bald head. And he was hauled in his name is Samir al-Quda, and he was hauled in by the secret police maybe 20 times when he was in Jordan. And then, but he was very in demand. It's sort of funny because we don't think of it that way, but like the Association of Dentists in Jordan or the Association of Doctors, they'll often invite a poet to speak at one of their gatherings because they just, even if it's a political speech, they love hearing it in beautiful language. And so he gave a speech in 1996 in his local town in which he compared Arab rulers to highwaymen, basically. And he said that the way consensus is built in our country is the leader gives a speech and everybody claps. And that's freedom of expression in our country when you're allowed to clap for the ruler's speech. Well, he was charged with slander, and it's a great word in Arabic. It's italat lisan, which is the lengthening of the tongue. And they threw him in jail for a year just for that one poem. And, he said it's very hard, this kind of struggle, because you don't want to sit at home and just accept to live under these systems, my friends who live in Jordan, you can't talk to them about the mukhabarat in public. They always call them the friends. The friends said this, the friends are doing that. And I have an academic friend that lives there, and he calls it an inconspicuous police state, because you don't feel it, in countries like under Saddam's Iraq or in Syria, you really kind of feel a tension after you spend a little bit of time there. And in Jordan, you don't feel it exactly, but it's there because if you want to be an ambassador, if you want to be a newspaper editor, if you want to be a university professor, your file has to go to the mukhabarat first for approval, and they sort of run the country that way. And it is just, in every Arab country, it is a powerful, ubiquitous institution that the leaders who, they don't have a popular mandate, and their answer for strengthening things is to make sure that the secret police are stronger all the time. And, they are a law unto themselves. I mean, the most amazing example in Jordan was the head of the secret police was a chain smoker. And when he was on a Royal Jordanian flight from, say, London back to Amman, he would smoke. And, you're not allowed to smoke on any airplanes in the world practically anymore. And people would complain, and the airline would say, we'll put you on another flight if you want to, but he's the head of the secret police, and there's nothing we can do about it. And that is the problem in a lot of those Middle Eastern countries, is that there's laws on the books, but the laws are not applied equally. And the example that I use in the book for this is Morocco. And the Article 23 of the Moroccan Constitution says the king's person is inviolable and sacred. It's one sentence, and that's all it is. And that means that anybody who says anything critical of the king is considered violating the sacred values of Morocco. And people run into it all the time. I mean, a journalist, for example, when I was there at one point, had written an article saying the king was going to sell one of his palaces to turn it into a luxury hotel. And the the government prosecuted him successfully. They brought a chunk of the palace in, and they said, this belongs to the king, and the king is sacred, and by extension, anything the king owns is sacred, and so he was violating the sacred values of Morocco, and the prosecution won the case. But the man who had the most tortured example of that was a man named Ahmed Marzouki that I met, and he had been a young army recruit in 1970 when he was loaded onto a truck with a bunch of other young conscripts, and they were told, we're going on a live fire exercise, and just follow orders. And they came to a golf course and were told, just open fire on the people on the golf course, and they were opening fire on, the cabinet and the king's best friends and hoping to kill the king, is what the officers had in mind. So the officers who led it, it was unsuccessful, were executed live by firing squad on television, and the junior guys like Ahmed were sentenced to 5 years in jail each. And then while their court case was in train, there was a second attempt to assassinate the king in 1972. They tried to shoot down his plane, and so the king just said, I'm going to make an example out of the first group, and so he had a prison built in the desert called Taz Mamar, and he just sort of threw 58 conscripts or sort of junior officers into it who'd taken a part in the first group and threw away the key. And Ahmed, he calls it, I lived an eternal night. And the stories are just horrific because basically when they first got there were 58 men and they got 4 loaves of bread every day, and that's what they had for food. They had to divide 4 loaves of food between 58 men, and there was no medical care. One guy had some sort of debilitating disease that took him 11 years to die, and he never saw a doctor in all those 11 years. And they finally got word to their families after the guards became sympathetic enough, but the families couldn't do anything because the government just denied that it existed. And then their break came when the daughter of one of the men in the prison came in among the top 10 students in the high school completion exams in Morocco. And the king meets the top 10 students, and at the end of the session with the king, he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And the girl said, "When are you going to let my father out of Tazmamart?" And, the king turns casually to one of his aides and he said, "Is anybody still alive in Tazmamart?" And even with that started an international campaign. And even with that, it took another 2 years to get them out of jail. And, Ahmed, I've never met Nelson Mandela, but he comes the closest to any figure that I've ever met that's like that, because he's just had this horrible experience of, 19 years of his life in prison for no reason. And he said, "I never understood sort of the capricious nature of power until, I was thrown into jail like that and had no recourse to get out." And so now he spends all his life campaigning for, a greater separation of powers, an independent judiciary, police supervision, and, public rights of free speech and things like that. But it's difficult for him to make any headway because that right to organize just doesn't exist almost anywhere in the Arab world. And the place that I ran into this, that was the most striking was Saudi Arabia, because, the reputation of Saudi Arabia abroad is kind of like oil and camels, and since 9/11 it's kind of oil, camels, and extremists. But there is an incredibly educated, erudite population in Saudi Arabia that makes it an absolute joy to spend time and work in that country. They're very hospitable and welcoming. But so I spent a lot of time with them, and I met 2 people in particular who were kind of questioning the system in Saudi Arabia and got into trouble for doing it. And they worked totally independently. They didn't know each other, but they had reached very similar conclusions. And one was a theologian named Hassan Maliki, and he grew up very poor in the south of the country. Walked 10 kilometers to school every day, and he was the first member of his family to go to university. And when he got to university, he was expecting, this great intellectual experience, and he was going to be able to question everything. And he went to a religious university. Instead, he found this rigid doctrinaire curriculum where, they were lectured about what Muhammad wore and how they should wear the same thing. They should wear a short gown and trim their beard in a specific way because that's the way Muhammad did it. And any attempts to question, the theology was just unacceptable. And so, he started researching into why that was, and his sort of conclusion was that Islam, as it is practiced in Saudi Arabia, is all about the sort of political, historical, military version of Islam, and it has very little to do with the spiritual side of it. And he started looking around, and he decided that the source of that was the Umayyad dynasty, which is sort of like the first pan-Arab dynasty that ruled from Damascus from 1661 to 750. And they were the ones that had come up with a formula that if a ruler is rightly guided by Islam, then the people and the population have no right to question them. And they had sort of passed that down through the generations, and the sort of spiritual godfather of the Wahhabi sect that is prevalent in Saudi Arabia is a 13th century theologian named Ibn Taymiyyah, and he sort of held the Umayyads up as the example, and the Saudis sort of took that example, and they basically rule along the same system that that as long as the El Saud dynasty is following Islam, then the population has no right to question the way the country is governed. And he had reached, Hassan had reached the conclusion. He said, if we had real Islam, the way, the Koran lays it out, there would be no, aggressive jihad, there would be no death to converts, and you would be allowed to question everything, because that's the way, the book is structured. And the other person that I met that had reached this conclusion was an education professor, a woman named Fawzia al-Bakr. And Fawzia is one of the strongest, most outspoken, most admirable women I met in my time in the region. And just as a mark of what she did, she had been home for 3 days. She'd back in Saudi Arabia for 3 days after being away for almost a decade in 1990. And this was right after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and the Iraqi army was sitting on the border and nobody knew whether they were going to come over or not, and women don't have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia. And so the women were saying, we really need the right to drive. We're in the middle of a war, and if we need to flee with our children, we have to know that we have to get into a car and go. And so a group of about 47 women drove on the freeways of Riyadh. And Riyadh is an incredible city because it was built and designed by Americans, so it looks like Arizona, but the mindset is sort of from an earlier time. And so the women drove, and they were, the sort of westernized Saudis were thrilled, and they thought this was the beginning of, they galvanized the movement. And I think the protest movement, and this was going to be the first, step toward real change in the kingdom. And they drove on like a Wednesday or Tuesday, I don't quite remember. And on Friday, every two-bit mosque preacher in that country, every imam around just sort of laid into them and said they were whores and that they had not been brought up in Islamic households and it was a shame and they should be fired and divorced. And, Fawzia showed up at work the next day, on that Sunday, and, her name had been torn off her door, and kafra was written there, which means infidel, and they took away her passport, and she lost her job for 18 months. And, she said, if you had told me 15 years ago that my taking part in that demonstration would make sure that I could never serve on a panel or never be promoted, and B, that I still wouldn't have the right to drive, I just never would have believed you. But, despite that struggle, she continued to believe that, it was her right and her duty to try and overturn those laws. And she focused a lot on the amount of, religion in the schools. She just sort of said there's much too much religion in the curriculum, and she was trying to change that. But just on the day-to-day thing, it was interesting because just how these kind of things work. I needed to take a picture of her because I was writing a big story about her in the newspaper. We hadn't taken her picture, so I called her up and I said, I've got the photographer with me, can I come over now and take the picture? She's like, sure, no problem. And we go over there, and by the time we got over there, she'd kind of thought about the consequences. And there's a law in Saudi Arabia called khulwa, where an unmarried man and a man and woman who are not married cannot be in the same enclosed space together. And she suddenly realized, she'd sort of been careful to have her husband around, but he wasn't there when I wanted to take the picture. And she wasn't sure how to deal with that, with taking the picture, because she didn't want to take the veil off inside the house, because then she would be accused, of having been unveiled in front of someone who was not her husband, and or she was not related to. But she didn't want to wear the veil inside the house because it would look weird that she was doing it. So she agreed to be photographed in the street. And she took along her 6-year-old son, because in the eyes of the religious police, her 6-year-old son could be her guardian. It lasted about 15 minutes, the photography session, and then she just said, I just can't do this anymore, I have to go inside. And at first I thought she was being overly cautious, and then I met some of the women who had run-ins with the religious police, and I realized that she was being incredibly brave. And her conclusion on all this stuff was that, they keep us busy with this little trivial stuff, like how we're dressed around other men or things like that, so we don't ask the big questions about who's ruling the country. And in all or most of the Arab world, who's ruling the country is either one family, one sect, or one sort of military clique. And, they gain so much from that power, in terms of wealth and power, that they are loath to give it up. The Al Sauds are the biggest example, because, it used to be when King Abdulaziz unified the kingdom in 1932. It was sort of a small group, and he ran it like a household. He kept the treasury in a trunk under his bed, and he gave people money. And, to a certain extent, the Saudis are still trying to run it that way, but it's a country of 27 million people. And it just isn't run terribly well. But, they control a quarter of the world's oil reserves, and then no one knows how much money the family siphons off, so they're not about to give that up without a struggle. And in Syria, it's an Alawite minority regime. It's sort of offshoot. Some people say they're legitimate Muslims, some people don't. But it's definitely, the Sunni what used to be the Sunni ruling class sort of considered the Alawites, good material for servants and not much else. And so the Alawites are not about to secede power out of fear of what will happen to them. And it's, they've been in power for so long, they changed the constitution so that the son could inherit from the father. And Bashar was only 34, and the constitution said you had to be 40 to be president. So they just said, we'll change the constitution, and the new age is required to be president is, lo and behold, 34. In every one of these countries, it's impossible to change. Libya and Egypt, of course, seem to be slouching toward some sort of dynastic rule, although we don't know yet. And even when kings or others come in that say they want to change it, King Hamad in Bahrain, for example, came in and said, I'm going to build a deep democracy, and we're going to change everything here. We're going to have a new constitution that gives much more power to the people. And then there was just such aggressive criticism of the way the government is run, is that he changed his mind. And he did a new constitution all on his own without consulting the people, as he had promised he would. And I spent time in that country with the sort of first person to open a website and a blog about Bahrain. Ali, the guy who ran this, said, he had this bitter joke, and he said, in the Middle East, a constitutional monarchy means the monarch writes the constitution. And he was sort of hoping that his online protest was going to sort of galvanize people to bring change, and it didn't. And he said, basically, it has come down to, you can say what you want to, and we're going to do what we want to, and it was a standoff in that way. And so, people wonder if, with the political opposition has been so ineffective for so many years in the Middle East, whether the online version is going to change that. And there have been a few indications along the way that it might work. There was a woman in Egypt who was trying to express solidarity with a bunch of textile workers who were protesting, and so she said, on April 6th, 2007 or 2008, nobody should go to work. And, the government completely freaked out because she got like 76,000 friends on Facebook within a matter of a very short time. And so they were sure that this was a mass protest movement. So they ordered everybody to go to work. And nothing makes Egyptians quite as ornery as the government telling them to do something. So they stayed away in huge numbers, also out of fear because there were so many policemen and riot police on the streets that they were really worried about what was going to happen. So it was considered this great success, and everybody was predicting that Facebook was the wave of the political future. And then she tried it the next year, and it didn't work. And we've seen more and more examples of that in all countries across the region. That you see it with Al Jazeera too. And I happen to be a great admirer of Al Jazeera. It has a terrible reputation in this country, but as a reporter working in the region, they just unearthed an incredible number of dissident voices. And, if they had a program where Colonel Gaddafi was making some claim about Libya, then they would bring someone on, someone from the opposition who'd been in London or someone, working in obscurity, and you suddenly had a voice from the other side. But I think people, that has been going on for almost a decade now, and it hasn't been longer than a decade, but a decade since Al Jazeera gained prominence. And there's sort of frustration that it isn't working, and that civil society isn't growing this way, that it's just sort of voices out there making noise, and it doesn't mean anything. And one of the problems is that the governments fight it because they say, well, if we open everything up, then you're going to get the Islamic tsunami, and we're the only dike between you and Muslim radicalism. And it is a dilemma in the Middle East about what to do about the Islamic Party, because they are very well organized. They organize through the mosque. And they also, it is a legitimate political movement because people do believe, they have strong faith, and they want to see their religion reflected in their society and in their politics. So there's going to have to be some accommodation made to sort of, you can't have reform without having some kind of accommodation to those Muslim political groups. And sort of the grandfather of them all is the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded by an elementary school teacher in Egypt in 1928, and he basically had three main points. And that was that, the Koran has all the prescriptions that you need for a political and a social system, that Muslims have fallen on hard times and been colonized because they got away from the Koran, and as soon as they get back to it, they will regain their former glory, and that there's always going to be people working against them. And the more radical parties that have come along since said they're too accommodating, because the basic philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood is we can wait it out because we have a superior system and everyone will come to us eventually. But the worry is, because there's been a few examples where they've started to exert power, is that they're going to do it by force, and they're never terribly reassuring when you talk to them. In the book, I spend a lot of time with a Muslim brother parliamentarian, from Alexandria in Egypt, and I asked him, well, are you going to enforce Islamic law? And he said, well, no, but everyone will eventually recognize that it's superior and they'll want it. And you say, well, are you going to force women to wear the veil? And he said, no, but, all the women will eventually recognize it's superior and they will want it. And, are you going to ban alcohol, in areas? And you say, well, I know the tourists want it, but eventually all the Muslims will realize that drinking alcohol is a bad idea and they'll want it banned. And so they make everybody edgy in that way. And I think in talking to the people, I always found that they wanted the Islamic parties, because when we talk about reform, we think of that they're going to have a system like ours, but when they talk about reform, their main concern is sort of corruption and malfeasance. And they want, a government that's not going to steal from them, and they want, a certain amount of economic security, and they want an amount of personal security. They won't want to be afraid of the knock of the secret police in the middle of the night. And so they sort of think that their best chance of getting that is with the Muslim Brotherhood. But I think, and there are others that believe, that if you allow, civil society to expand and you foster that growth, then you're going to get more alternatives than just the Muslim Brotherhood. And how does the U.S. go about that? And one of the questions I get asked all the time is, how do people react to you as an American? What do they think of America? What do they think of American values? And I must say that, having lived in the region for so many years, I am always amazed by just how generous, welcoming, and just that sense of hospitality. They just do not hold what the American government does against me. And the one exception to that was probably in 2003. And, obviously my colleagues in Iraq bore the brunt of it. And I think 89 journalists have been killed since the beginning of the Iraq War. But I was never, that one year, because every time they turned on the TV, they'd see American tanks rolling across Iraq, or, American soldiers battering down the doors. And so they were sort of mad at Americans for most of 2003. And I sensed it, but I always wanted to know what the reaction was, so I never really wanted to lie. Some people say, I'm Swiss, I'm Brazilian, I'm whatever, that doesn't have any political any dog in that fight, as it were. And but I'd always say, well, I'm from New York, because then it would take them sort of 10 more seconds to figure out that was American, and I could have sort of 10 more seconds of pleasant conversation. And they were never really rude. They were just sort of, Egyptians love to banter with you, and people in that part of the world, they ask you about your life, your wife, your kids, and they would just stop, and they would just sort of, do whatever transaction was at hand. And there were a few nasty incidents. Some of, I was in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and someone threw a full can of Pepsi at me. It, bounced away harmlessly. But anyway, it was a little bit, sort of unsettling, because you never quite knew what the reaction might be. My favorite reaction, though, was I broke a tooth in Jeddah, and it was late at night, and it snapped off, and so I had to go to a dentist the first thing in the morning. So I go into this dental clinic, and the first dentist that was available was a Syrian, and I said, where are you from? And he said, Aleppo. And I said, where'd you study dentistry? And he said, the University of Aleppo. And I said, where'd you go after that? And he said, no, I didn't go anywhere after that. And I was, sort of trying to rack my brain, thinking, how good is the dentistry school at the University of Aleppo? And he's fiddling with his instruments, and, he's testing his jabbers and his pokers. He says, why? Where are you from? And I said, New York. And he said, American, and he's starting the drill. That's not a very popular thing to be. Open wide. But he did a fantastic job, and it's still in there. I think that there is some admiration for the United States, but people don't want to be dictated as to, what kind of government they should have. And Secretary of State Rice gave a famous speech in Cairo in 2005, and she said, for 60 years we've pursued stability and at the expense of democracy and achieved neither, but it was a very sort of lukewarm policy, and it didn't go anywhere. And I think the emphasis on democracy kind of failed because people identify Iraq with democracy, and they were told that, this is the democracy enterprise, the American invasion of Iraq. And so, we kind of take our system for granted. And we know how democracy is supposed to work, but if you haven't lived with it and you're told, well, democracy is coming to Iraq, and then the next thing you know, 100,000 people are dead, you think, well, I don't want democracy. And I think that that's one of the things that the United States has to do a better job. There's basically three things that they do a better job of. And one is talking to people in their own vocabulary. And sort of, they're uneasy about the idea of democracy. They think it's a Western concept that's being foisted upon them. And freedom, they also, freedom, to a certain extent, they just associate with a lack of values in the West. And, it's freedom to do whatever the hell you want. But there are concepts that exist within Islam and within their culture that translate into those, into opening up the political system. The concept of justice is very strong, and the concept of dignity is very strong. So, you have to use a vocabulary in talking to them that they feel like, they're part of that and they want to have a hand in constructing it. And the second thing is I think you need to support all agents of change, no matter who they are. Sometimes, you look at the Syrian, there's some incredibly brave people in Syria working for human rights who get thrown in jail. And the United States government does a very poor job about speaking out in support of them because we don't really think Syria, they sort of, the policy on Syria is a little bit undecided. And I think whether you think the agents of change are working in your interests or not, ultimately they're working to better their societies, and so they need some kind of support. They don't need an endorsement, because an endorsement would actually undermine them at the moment, because American credibility is so low that if you say, I think Joe is doing a great job and he's going to bring democracy to your country, they're going to say, forget about Joe, he is an agent of a foreign power. But you do need to know that those values matter, that, the fact that Ahmed al-Bunni in Syria is working to make sure that there's freedom of speech in Syria. You say that freedom of speech is an important value. And, the Egyptian government, there was a guy, everyone says, no one cares about politics, they're tired of it. But Ayman Noor ran for president in Egypt, and he managed to get 7% of the vote. And the first thing the government did was throw him in jail because he had the audacity to challenge the president. But he really got sort of the middle class galvanized behind a political movement, which no one had done for years. So those kind of people, they don't need a direct endorsement, but any kind of repression against them, you have to speak out against it. And I think, President Obama made some steps in that direction with his speech in Cairo. He talked about, the United States needed to listen more, it needed to promote the interests of ordinary people, and it needed to set up sort of a scholarship program in the region. And, aid is often aid has a terrible reputation in the United States, and there was a poll taken earlier this year, and 65% of Americans said we just give too much foreign aid. But when you actually break down the numbers, the United States does give more aid than any other country. It's $22 billion. But the United Nations has a standard for what constitutes real generosity. And they say that real generosity is for every $100 your economy generates, you should give away 70 cents. And for every $100 that the United States generates, they give away 18 cents. So it's a very low number. Not very many countries, it has to be said, reach that 70-cent mark. There's like 5 countries in Northern Europe, basically, the Dutch and the Scandinavian countries do reach it. But, aid has to be done. And, sometimes I'm asked, do Arabs want freedom? Do Iranians want freedom? As if somehow, by culture, religion, education, tradition, genetics, somehow that they're just not interested in it. And, I posed that question to Samir, and this is the last point I'll make. Samir, the poet in Jordan, I said, do Arabs want to live in democratic systems, or, are they genetically somehow, or are they disposed not to? And he said, just think of it like automobiles. Like, everyone in the world drives cars, but if you came to the Arab world, everybody would be riding a donkey. And the government would tell you, this is our tradition. We like donkeys. And you have to know that that is a lie. We want to be like everyone else. We want to be normal. And I think that that is the mood that needs to be supported throughout the Middle East. Thank you very much.
I'm guess two parts to the question. One thing is, I wonder, you said a little bit about sort of the relationship between the assumption that we often have that democracy and secularism will go hand in hand. One thinks of the example of the elections in Palestine. Once the Palestinians had actually democratically elected Hamas, they had to pay for it dearly, and that was not recognized by the United States and Israel, even though supposedly the elections were supported. So, what are your thoughts about this? How to get sort of around this assumption that democracy inherently somehow implies secularism? And the second thing that I was just wondering about, the title of the talk refers to Lebanon, obviously, but you didn't say anything about Lebanon in your points, and it seems that some of the sort of generalizations that you made, you were saying in most of the Middle East, and I had to think in many other cases that Lebanon poses kind of an interesting exception in some of the ways that the democracy works there.
I didn't, Lebanon was not one of the 6 countries that I'm going to take your second question first, and then I'll get back to the other one. It wasn't one of the 6 countries that I concentrated on because they do have, most of the institutions that the others lack in terms of, civil society. And the book is sort of divided into 2 halves, as it were. In one half, I talk about that gap between perception and reality, and that's where it comes in because the title comes from an email that I received. When you work in Hizbollah territory in the south of Beirut or in the southern suburbs, you have to fill out like 4 pages or 5 pages of paperwork, where you went to college, who your mother is, etc. And then one of the things they ask you is your birthday, and then on my next birthday, I opened my email and there was a happy birthday message from Hizbollah at hizbollah.org. And so it's just sort of like how our perception of how the organization works and the reality are not always the same. But I also think that the Lebanese political system is sort of stuck in a similar way in that, there has been a little bit of change in terms of the feudal families that control it, but those feudal dynasties like the, Hariri's, would Saad Hariri in any other country be the prime minister? It's unlikely. And, they have the same dynastic problem in that people don't want to relinquish power to the most capable. I think that in terms of, your point with Hamas is well taken. And then, that's sort of where the U.S. policy started to fall apart because, they said, we've sacrificed, we've pursued stability and sacrificed democracy and achieved neither. And then the first example was Hamas, and they're like, oh my God, who's winning these elections? And, that is the problem, is that the only alternative, and certainly the reason that most Gazans voted in Hamas, there are a certain percentage of them that, support their idea of religious principles, but most of them voted in because they think Fatah is a corrupt organization that has done nothing for them, and they want to be rid of it. And if there was another alternative, they might vote for them. And, there's been several attempts to do it. The Jordanians had this big study about how you, foster other political parties, and they decided that, you do it the same way you foster seats for women, is that you set aside a certain number of seats for, other parties, and you allow them to grow. Because, certainly people like Samir, the poet that I talked to, he was not interested in a religious party. He wanted a secular party, but there wasn't really an alternative there. He said, there's a Ba'athist party. Why is there still a Ba'athist party after we've seen what Ba'athism does? And so the solution that this committee came up with is in Jordan is that, you help foster other parties by reserving a certain number of seats until they can stand on their own feet. And you make religious parties, sort of agree, you hinge their participation in guaranteeing that they're not going to be, one man, one vote, one time, that they accept the political process and that they sort of don't believe in weapons or coercion as a way of running the government. And they didn't get a chance to try it because, King Abdullah was having none of it, and he just sort of shelved the plan and said thank you very much and made no attempt to implement it. But, there are people that are trying to find ways around that.
The rise of multiple media organizations hasn't necessarily been a good thing for news in the Arab world. Just like in the United States, you have such a saturation of news all over the place that inevitably political views come out. I was wondering if you would comment on that, if you think that's the case, because he says that when it was just Al Jazeera, the news was a lot better and people were getting a lot more informed, and you did see some progress in terms of change coming to the Middle East. And now that there is a saturation of the news, I guess the news industry, that's kind of tailing off now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Professor Lynch does a great job in sort of paying attention to the Arab media on a day-to-day basis. And I think, I mean, Al Jazeera definitely had problems in that its news was excellent. It was just really on the ball and fast, but its talk shows were often, politically oriented from the beginning. It did give people sort of a false hope that this was going to change things, and it's just not enough. I mean, most of the governments just shuttered it, and then they set up alternatives. But it's interesting because it still has a certain amount of power, because a bunch of Arab, communications ministers, which is another sort of set of fossils left over from the Soviet system, got together in Cairo, and they tried to promulgate rules for the quote-unquote 400 satellite channels in the Arab world. And all the rules, when you read through them, were basically how to shut down and shut up Al Jazeera. There was all about you can't insult the country, you can't report this, you can't report that. It's just, I mean, I think even if there was only Al Jazeera, the problem to an extent is that just electronic, media, even in this country, we see the same things. People, make strong political statements on the TV, and it sort of raises the collective blood pressure in the country. But when it comes down to making policy, it's the politicians and the people on the ground that do it. So it helped freedom of speech, and it certainly, the Al Jazeera trickled down to newspapers. The newspapers in Cairo, there's a couple of newspapers that are much freer and report on much more information than they ever were able to before, and it's because Al Jazeera kind of pushed open on that door. So I think, we also expect change to come too fast. So I think they laid the groundwork for it, but there is no substitute for just political organizing on the ground and getting new parties in place and new politicians, which they haven't had in any of those countries for a very long time.
I have a perception that the Arab story is very little heard in the United States. I just wanted to know if you think that's the case. For example, I was reading in the London Review of Books. There's this long article about why they believe the Lockerbie bombers had nothing to do with Libya. And this is the first, I just assumed that the guy was guilty, and this is the first I had heard that there was any question. And if he wasn't guilty, then you would think, and the same thing for the Israeli-Palestine problem. Is the Arab story undertold by our media in the United States?
I think I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I sort of felt like that aspect of the Arab world is undercovered. But it's a little bit of, it is a problem of attitudes, and a little bit of it is a problem of resources. And I was just saying this earlier to I was talking to some high school teachers before I came in here, and it used to be that there were about 9 or 10 American newspaper correspondents in the region. When there's a violence going on involving the American military, the idea that people are going to be covering, resources are going to be thrown at other stories is a little bit unrealistic. And that's part of the problem, is that, once the American military went on the ground in Iraq, that became the overwhelming story. But it's also just, newspapers have had to pull back. And I would fight this all the time. When I was working in Egypt on a story on aid, like how is U.S. aid perceived, and I had been working on it for months, and I tried to find doctors in a clinic that received American support to run their clinics, but didn't necessarily agree with American values. And I was working on various. There was also a big judicial reform effort that was kind of derailing because the lawyers got wind of the fact that the American government was underwriting it, and so they didn't want to take part. Anyway, it was kind of a theme, and I've been working on it for months. And then, Al-Qaeda blew up a tanker off the coast of Yemen, and my editors called me up and said, "You got to go to that." And I argued and I lost, and I can't say that they were wrong. Because when someone's blowing up oil tankers on the high seas, you want to know about it. And so it's a little bit, we're all, as reporters, you only have so many hours in the day, and when there's a huge, overwhelming story like that, it just sort of it sucks up a lot of the oxygen, unfortunately.
I had a question referring back to your comment about the woman who organized on Facebook. And I know people that I hang out with are just really excited about social media and Twitter and Facebook and how it's a game changer, it's going to change everything. I don't care what industry you're in. How much do you think online communities are going to help people in the Middle East? I don't know if there's any blocking and stuff like that of certain sites in certain countries, but just wondering if whether it's communicating with people outside the country or within their own country organizing, if you think it's actually going to have any effect at all.
I think that it works in some. I mean, it is blocked in some cases. The Syrians block it all the time, and they say that the Israelis will try and recruit spies via Facebook, so they have to shut it down. It allows for a public square that doesn't exist. Like that woman in Egypt would have never found a way to communicate, to 76,000 people if Facebook didn't exist. I mean, for years there was a movement called Enough in Egypt. And Kafaya, it was a political movement. It's like, we've had enough of the system. And it was mostly, journalists and lawyers. And they would have a weekly protest on the steps of the journalists and lawyers, on the journalist syndicate. And, the riot police would be out in quadruple rows, around them, because they knew that if they got out into the streets of Cairo, they would get millions in an instant. And so they kept them very hedged in. And so, Facebook allows you to sort of vault over those lines of policemen and communicate to others in the country, and you can kind of share ideas. But ultimately, you have to change the system, with laws, and, you change the laws through the parliament or however you do it. And so it's an imperfect system because they don't translate automatically into feet on the ground on the streets protesting. Like, people can make all the noise they want on the internet. It doesn't make much difference. If there's 2 million people protesting in downtown Cairo and they bring traffic to a halt, the government has to address it. And that is, the weakness to a certain extent, in that it allows people, to understand that there's others out there with a common interest, but it doesn't give them the tool they need to affect change.
Yes, you seem to have presented 2 images of Egypt, it seems to me. One of, you have an aged ruler and the possibility of a dynasty, perhaps Mubarak's son will rule after him. You've mentioned instances of repression in Egypt. But there's also been a history of lively protest, going all the way back to 1919. And you also mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been reviled and imprisoned, now is operating within the political mainstream, and some would even consider it a kind of an opposition party. So it's gained wider acceptance and toleration from the government. So we know that Mubarak doesn't have many years left. I'm wondering if you could look into the future, and do you have any cause for optimism about the possibility for real change in Egypt?
We don't know that Mubarak isn't going to live forever, because you ask a Cairo cab driver why he's been there for so long, and he said, at night he sneaks into the Egyptian museum and he squeezes the mummies and he drinks the juice from the mummies, and that's why he's going to live forever. But it is, it's true that they've had one system there more or less since Nasser took power, and it's an open question what comes next, because Mubarak has been sort of grooming his son, but we don't really know if he's going to succeed, because everybody thinks that if he really wants to put his son in power, he's going to have to do it while he's still alive. And he doesn't want to do that because he thinks, he's the man to rule Egypt. And there's sort of a sense that it's his wife that's pushing his son. Now, whether he could, whether Gamal, the son, could win on his own, because he obviously has huge name recognition, and again, the wisdom of taxi drivers, which I don't write about, but I always try and they say, well, he might be a good president because his father's had, 30 years to rip off the country, so they've stolen all the money they need, and maybe he'll be a good ruler. But I think that the answer to that is that, Egyptians themselves don't know. You ask some of them, and they said, in the 1940s, before Nasser came in, we had a vibrant political system. We had parties across the spectrum. We basically have, the people who were in their 20s then are in their 80s now, and they're running the same parties. And what we just need is fresh blood. And I have a filmmaker friend named Atiat Abnoudi, and she said, we've had a civilization here for 5,000 years, and Egypt has worked best when there's one guy sitting, where the Nile forks, and he runs the whole country. And no matter how much you support democracy, and no matter how much you support change, that is, the model that works in Egypt. And she, works in an NGO that's trying to change laws and change things. And I think basically what people expect to happen is that when, the military is the unknown quantity, because they've run the country more or less since 1952. So when Mubarak dies, is the military going to get together and decide, like they always had, that one of them is going to be the next ruler, or are they going to get together and say, okay, we're going to have elections and and throw it open? And if they do, obviously that will create a sea change there. And since Egypt was sort of the model for everybody else in the region, that would have an enormous influence. But I don't think we're going to know that until the day Mubarak dies or soon thereafter.
I wanted to ask you a question relating to your experience in the Middle East as a journalist. You had mentioned earlier arguing with your editors about going to certain assignments, things like that. So occasionally when I read, even in the New York Times, things about the Middle East, I feel that the essence of the truth is there, but it may have been tweaked or filtered to the degree that it would be acceptable to its core readership. Did you have similar struggles with your editors on the events that you were reporting? Because I listened to you tonight, and I'm on your wavelength and seeing somebody who knows the big picture, as you mentioned earlier in your book. You address the life of the people there, but did you have similar experiences in the actual journalism itself?
I know that there's a history that's occasionally happened in the past at the New York Times, that editors try and sort of manipulate the direction of a story. I personally did not experience it. There were arguments about what priority and where to go and things like that, but they pretty much felt that, I grew up in the region, I spoke the language, I had a better command of the area than they did, and so I could set my own agenda. And by and large, that's how it worked. And even the editing process, I never felt one of my stories was changed to reflect, you always want more space, right? You always feel aggrieved that you didn't get enough inches in the paper. But I never really felt like they had interfered in any way to change the tone of what I was writing. And I think, I honestly think, somebody was asking me this earlier today about whether the New York Times was pushing the war in Afghanistan, and I'm always sort of taken aback by that, because I don't think of the New York Times as a collective organization, because I just see how the reporters work, and we're all we're not free agents, obviously, but we're very independent agents, and everybody kind of decides for themselves. Yes, you need editors, but they give you an enormous amount of leeway to write what you want. I guess the bottom line is that I never felt unfairly treated the whole time I was working for them in the region, and I really felt like I got to write, what I want within, did I not want to go cover the 16th bombing in a row in Saudi Arabia? Yes, I would have preferred to do something else, but there was a bombing and there was violence, and, I had to go do that, obviously.
Hi. You mentioned that you were given kind of leeway because you knew the language and you grew up there. Is this usually, in terms of language, is this usually the case for reporters that go into the Middle East? And if not, what kind of barriers exist for people who don't speak Arabic or don't understand it?
Yeah, it's one of the regions. It's funny, if you go to China or Russia, Japan to a certain extent on assignment, they take a year and teach the correspondents intensively the language, because the feeling is you can't really operate without it. But one of the ironies of the Middle East is that the people that run those countries are generally, or at least sort of at the ministerial level, are so well educated that they all speak English. And there's sort of, because of the colonial history, there's English language newspapers, and you can kind of get by. And then there's also an enormous number of educated people. And I mentioned in the dedication to my book that in every country, I had 23 countries, right? So I could not be on top of everything in every country all the time, because I had to pay attention to what I was working on at that moment. But I had a sort of core group of 10 people around the region, and when something erupted suddenly in Yemen or in Jordan, there was a person that I could work for me who I could call up and say what's going on, and they would feed to me. So, there is a system of sort of fixers and locals who have their eyes and ears open, who sort of are the interpreters for a lot of the news that you see. And, your news coverage is often only as good, as your fixers. Now, I could get around that because I'd have the TV on and I'd see stuff, and so I was more alert to it. But people who don't speak the language are basically, dependent to a certain extent on, the quality of the people that are working around them. Now, there's other sources, of course. There's embassies, there's all kinds of opposition figures, human rights organizations that help you out. But ultimately, it's the people that are, working immediately in your office that are the most helpful and the most sort of have the most influence on what you end up writing.
Well, thank you very much.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.